We're hearing a lot right now about the lack of affordable housing in Australia. The charity Anglicare this week reported that less than 2% of private rental properties are affordable for people on minimum wages. And if you are on welfare benefits, that number is virtually zero.
Public housing is an option for some low-income earners, of course, but state and territory governments have been backing out of that sector in recent years. The federal opposition today, we're hearing, pledging to fund the construction of 30,000 new dwellings, while the centrepiece of the policy is being unveiled today. It's this equity stake, but that is in privately purchased homes, not public homes. According to our next guest, Australia has a lot to learn from other countries when it comes to our public housing sector. Professor Andrew Scott from the Australia Institute and Deakin University's Nordic Policy Centre is with us. Professor, good morning to you.
Good morning, John.
In Australia, rightly or wrongly, public housing has a pretty bad reputation in some of our big cities. Vertical slums, Stalinist sort of skyscrapers that seem to become, kind of a focal point for all of social ills. Is that a reasonable kind of stereotype that has developed? Is that the reality of public housing in Australia?
No, it's not the reality of public housing in Australia. Those stereotypes reflect the fact that public housing has been run down to such a small proportion of overall housing, down around 4%. It was 7% back in the 1990s, and it was higher than that in the post-war reconstruction period in Australia. Public housing doesn't have to be high-rise. It doesn't have to be run down. It can be high-quality housing, and it is in very many countries in the world, including major cities like Oslo in Norway and Copenhagen in Denmark.
So what are the models, not just of the physical architecture, whether they are towers or freestanding, shared spaces, as well as the different approaches that have been taken towards who's able to get into public housing and why?
Well, public housing is not seen as a second-rate option. There's a very high proportion of Swedes, for example. The Swedish national government built 1 million homes between 1965 and 1974. And they were for a widespread mix of people, a social mix. And that legacy continues today in a very high proportion of people who live in public housing. And the other thing that Sweden, Norway and Denmark do is that they support cooperative housing arrangements. So rather than people buying both their individual dwelling and the entire block of units or other types of dwelling that are in the complex, you can have your individual dwelling, you can own it, but you can have some shared spaces. Now, we have elements of that in Australia with strata title or body corporates, but that tends to favour investors rather than people who are looking for a home rather than to make a financial gain.
We, I guess, have a perception when it comes to some of the bigger government progressive policies of Nordic and Scandinavian nations that, oh, well, it's all very well for them. They tax their people to the hilt. Does it cost that much more to have governments involved in housing in this sort of way?
Not necessarily. I mean, public housing does cost money, and governments which contribute to it therefore need to pay that money. But the benefits of that in terms of people having secure housing and being more engaged with the workforce as a result and contributing themselves to tax revenue, pay for themselves. Cooperatives don't rely on government taxation because they are using the pooled resources of individuals coming together and the buying power that creates and the opportunities that creates. And I think that is something we need to expand definitely in Australia, in addition to other proposals that are now being aired.
The Labor Party today announcing details of their shared equity scheme, investing 30-40% with low and middle income earners in certain properties. I wonder what your initial reaction to that is based on the details you've seen, and also whether there would be scope in a program such as that for the government not just to be helping an individual or a couple, but the kind of collective group investment that you're talking about in Nordic nations.
I think it does have potential. I'm reading the media reports of the release this morning, like most people. And I think the important thing about it is that it shows a role for government, not continuing to leave the housing market so privatised and privatised in a way that's skewed towards investors, a role for government to ensure that the needs of most people for secure, decent housing, a place to live, are put first. And the idea of governments contributing towards equity is similar to the sharing of equity or co-ownership that cooperatives have in Nordic countries. So it has potential, and together with supply of more social or public housing for those who most need it, can help significantly to tackle housing affordability. And there's also, of course, the problem of homelessness.
One criticism we've already heard is that there is the risk that the government getting involved in this big-scale way, a little bit like negative gearing and others, could bump up prices. Do you see that as a significant danger?
Well, the scheme sounds like it's rather targeted towards lower income earners and some middle income earners and younger people. Therefore, its effect on demand and prices would be less than if it was less targeted. But yes, there are risks in tinkering with the existing arrangements in Australia. What is needed is a fairly fundamentally different approach, which includes a much stronger role for public housing. It's not dead yet in Australia, public housing, but it will be unless it's rebuilt from the low base, which has been run down to over some decades. So a combination of the kind of initiative that's been announced this morning, more public housing and considering cooperative arrangements for people to live in, not to invest in, like the Nordic countries, could really help tackle Australia's lack of housing affordability.
Professor Andrew Scott, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.